September 2nd, 1945, Tokyo Bay. A green-covered table sat on the deck of an American battleship, and across from it stood the last military face of the Japanese Empire. General Yoshijiro Umezu stepped forward with his back straight, his jaw locked, and his eyes fixed on the document in front of him. He did not bow. He did not lower his head. He did not offer the smallest visible sign that the empire he served had just been broken. 3 feet away, Douglas MacArthur watched him without saying a word. And that silence was the trap. Because MacArthur had not built that morning around a bow. He had built it so the bow would not matter. The table, the witnesses, the battleship, the harbor, the prisoners standing behind him, the cameras pointed from every angle, the documents waiting under Umezu's hand. All of it had been arranged to make one thing impossible. Not surrender. Japan had already agreed to that. The impossible thing was denial. What happened on the USS Missouri was not just the end of a war. It was a piece of architecture. And once Umezu touched that pen to the paper, there was no posture left in the world strong enough to undo what the room had already made permanent. 17 days earlier, the Japanese people had heard a voice many of them had never heard before. It was the voice of Emperor Hirohito, carried over radio, wrapped in court language so formal that ordinary citizens struggled to understand the words. But they understood the sound of it. The war was over. Japan had lost. Before that broadcast, Hiroshima had been burned by a single American B-29. 3 days later, Nagasaki. Then Soviet forces entered the war against Japan and crashed into Manchuria with terrifying speed. The empire was not being defeated from one direction. It was collapsing from every direction at once. But ending the fighting was not the same as ending the danger. MacArthur understood something many victors miss in the first warmth of victory. A defeated army can still win a future argument, not with tanks, not with aircraft, with memory, with photographs, with the story it tells its children later. He had watched Germany do it after 1918. The German army had lost the First World War, but in the years that followed, a poison story grew in the ruins. The army had not really been beaten. Politicians had betrayed it. Civilians had stabbed it in the back. The battlefield had not decided the war. A conspiracy had. That myth helped prepare the ground for Adolf Hitler. MacArthur had no intention of giving the Japanese military the same raw material, because the officers who would walk onto the Missouri were not shattered men begging for terms. They were men trained in a military culture where surrender was not simply failure. It was contamination. It was shame. It was a thing a soldier was supposed to outlive only if the emperor commanded him to do so. War Minister Korichika Anami had chosen ritual suicide on the morning of the emperor's surrender broadcast. Admiral Matome Ugaki had flown out on a final mission and died at the war's edge. These were not theatrical gestures. They were the logical final acts of a system that had taught its officers that death could be cleaner than surrender. So MacArthur was not worried that Umezu would throw the pen across the deck. He was worried about something colder. He was worried that Umezu could stand there like a professional soldier among professional soldiers, sign with perfect discipline, and leave behind an image that could later be twisted into something else. A negotiation, a formality, a transfer, a bitter but equal transaction between armies. That was the danger, not rebellion. Reinterpretation. So MacArthur designed the surrender as if he were designing a bridge that had to carry the weight of the next 100 years. The site was not accidental. The USS Missouri was an American battleship anchored in Tokyo Bay, not in neutral water, not in a palace hall, not in some diplomatic chamber where gestures could soften the fact of defeat. It sat in the harbor of Japan's capital, under Allied control, surrounded by the visible machinery of American naval power. Before a Japanese delegate took one step across the gangway, the setting had already spoken. Then MacArthur added the human evidence. Behind him, he placed General Jonathan Wainwright. Wainwright had surrendered Corregidor in 1942 and spent more than 3 years as a prisoner of the Japanese. By the time he reached the Missouri, imprisonment had carved itself into his body. He was thinner, older, and visibly marked by what captivity had done. Beside him stood Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, the British commander who had surrendered Singapore in 1942 after one of the greatest defeats in British military history. He, too, had been held by the Japanese. He, too, carried the visual record of captivity. MacArthur put those men where the Japanese delegation could not avoid seeing them. No speech was needed. No accusation was necessary. The men Japan had imprisoned would stand behind the man accepting Japan's surrender. Their bodies were testimony. Their faces were documents. At 8:56 in the morning, the Japanese delegation came aboard. 11 men. Military officers first, civilian diplomats behind them. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu climbed the gangway with a cane, his damaged leg the result of a bombing years earlier. General Umezu came as chief of the Army General Staff, the senior military representative of an army that had argued, even in August, that Japan might still bleed the invader badly enough to bargain. He came because the Emperor ordered him to come, not because defeat had entered his bones. MacArthur arrived at 9 Life. He did not hurry. He took his place at the microphone as hundreds of American sailors and officers crowded the decks above, looking down in total silence. Then he said the parties would execute the formal surrender. Simple words, flat words, words with no ornament. That was the point. Shigemitsu approached the table first. He sat down with difficulty. For a moment he did not sign. He looked over the document. The pause stretched. 1 minute on paper, an eternity on a battleship deck. MacArthur did not move. He did not fill the silence. Then, in a voice witnesses remembered for its sharp quietness, he told General Richard Sutherland to show the foreign minister where to sign. The hesitation ended. Shigemitsu signed. Then Umezu stepped forward. He did not sit. He leaned over the table, wrote his name, and straightened again. No bow, no glance of deference, no visible surrender in the face. But he had signed, and the document did not care what his face looked like. It proclaimed the unconditional surrender of Japanese Imperial General Headquarters and all Japanese armed forces wherever situated. It ordered civil and military officials to obey the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. It placed the authority of the Emperor and the Japanese government under MacArthur's direction for the purpose of carrying out surrender. That was the meaning of the ink, The posture was decoration. The signature was the wound. Allied representatives signed after him: the United States, China, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, New Zealand. At one point, the Canadian representative, Colonel Lawrence Moore Cosgrave, signed on the wrong line on the Japanese copy, forcing corrections by hand. Even the document that ended the most destructive war in history carried an imperfection in its own body. MacArthur noticed enough to keep the ceremony moving. The error did not matter. The structure did. The witnesses were there, the cameras were there, the signatures were there, the harbor was there. And when the ceremony ended, waves of Allied aircraft crossed above Tokyo Bay in formation. The war was over. But MacArthur knew a signature could stop a battle without building a peace. The Missouri had solved the first problem. It had made defeat undeniable. Now he faced the second. He had to govern a country of more than 70 million people with an occupation force that was too small for the task if Japan chose resistance. And those people had been told for years that American soldiers were monsters. The next act of architecture would not take place on a battleship. It would take place in a room in Tokyo. On September 27th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito came to meet MacArthur at the American Embassy. The meeting lasted less than an hour. What the two men said behind closed doors has never been fully settled in public memory. But the photograph taken after the meeting did more than any transcript could have done. MacArthur stood in an open-collar khaki uniform, without medals, without a tie, almost casual. The Emperor stood beside him in formal morning dress, stiff, small, correct, wrapped in the full costume of imperial ceremony. MacArthur was taller. MacArthur was relaxed. The Emperor looked as if every ritual protection around him had been stripped away. Japanese censors tried to suppress the image. MacArthur ordered it released. And when the photograph appeared in newspapers, millions of Japanese citizens saw something their political culture had never prepared them to see. The Emperor standing beside a foreign general as the smaller figure in the frame. MacArthur did not ask him to bow. Again, he did not need to. The image had already moved the center of authority, not by shouting, not by humiliating him in a public spectacle, by changing what the hierarchy looked like. That was MacArthur's method. Preserve what must remain visible. Redirect what must no longer control. Make the new reality so plain that everyone sees it before anyone can argue with it. The Emperor would not be arrested. He would not be tried as a war criminal. That decision enraged some people and shocked others. But MacArthur's intelligence advisors warned that removing Hirohito could produce civil disorder on a scale the occupation could not contain. The United States did not have an extra army waiting to police Japan if the imperial institution collapsed overnight. So MacArthur chose a colder route. He kept the vessel. He changed the current running through it. The Emperor would remain at the apex of Japanese symbolic life. But the source of political authority would be moved underneath him, away from divine command, away from military rule, and toward a constitutional order built under occupation pressure. That required documents. And documents move slowly unless someone makes them move fast. The Japanese government produced an early constitutional draft that preserved too much of the old imperial sovereignty. To MacArthur's staff, it looked like a doorway through which the old system could return. So the government section inside occupation headquarters, led by General Courtney Whitney and shaped in crucial ways by Colonel Charles Cadiz and other civilian-minded legal officers, was pushed into one of the strangest drafting races in modern constitutional history. They had days, not months. They worked through nights. They wrote for a country many of them were still struggling to understand. The pressure was real. If the Allied policy machinery outside MacArthur's direct control caught up before a draft existed, the Constitution might be designed by international committee, slowed by rival agendas, and softened until the old power structure could breathe again. MacArthur wanted the document finished before the opposition could organize around the empty space. The draft that emerged did something radical. It changed the emperor from sovereign ruler into symbol. It expanded civil rights. It moved political authority into elected institutions. And in Article 9, it placed into constitutional language a renunciation unlike anything the Japanese military tradition had ever imagined. Japan would renounce war as a sovereign right. It would renounce the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. It would not maintain land, sea, or air forces with war potential. For the military culture that had produced Umezu, Article 9 was more than a clause. It was a demolition charge placed inside the old machinery. The Japanese cabinet resisted. Some argued. Some were stunned. Negotiations changed wording around the edges. But the architecture remained. The Constitution was promulgated on November 3, 1946. It took effect on May 3, 1947. And the old empire became something almost no one on the Missouri deck could have imagined while the ink was still drying. A parliamentary democracy built under occupation, with the emperor preserved as symbol and war renounced at the level of constitutional identity. MacArthur did not stop with the Constitution. The occupation dismantled the army. It purged militarists from public office. It pushed land reform into rural Japan, weakening the landlord class that had helped support the old order. It attacked the Zaibatsu, the great industrial combines tied to pre-war power, even though parts of that economic campaign would later be reversed. Women gained political rights. New institutions began to take root in soil that had been blasted, hungry, and humiliated. None of it was clean. None of it was simple. Occupation is never innocent. It is power applied after defeat. But MacArthur's most durable move was that he did not rely only on force. He built dependency into structure. He used existing symbols where destroying them would be too expensive. He rewrote the documents that defined obedience. He moved faster than the old elite could recover. And for a short period the architecture held. Then the world changed. Not slowly, all at once. By 1947 and 1948, Washington was looking at Asia through a different lens. The Soviet Union was tightening its hold in Eastern Europe. Communism was gaining strength in China. Korea was divided at the 38th parallel. A weak Japan no longer looked only like a defeated enemy made safe. It began to look like a strategic problem. The American question shifted. How do we stop Japan from fighting again? Became, how do we keep Japan useful in a Cold War? That question cut directly across MacArthur's constitutional achievement. A disarmed Japan was morally satisfying in 1946. By 1950, to many defense planners, it looked strategically expensive. Then North Korea crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950. South Korean defenses buckled. American forces entered the war. MacArthur, still in Tokyo, became commander of United Nations forces. Suddenly, Japan was no longer only an occupied country. It was a staging ground, a supply base, a workshop, a harbor network, the rear area for a war exploding across the peninsula next door. Article 9 remained on paper, but the emergency forced a workaround. In August 1950, Japan created the National Police Reserve, 75,000 men, under a name carefully chosen to sound like internal security, not an army. In practical terms, it was the first step toward rearmament. MacArthur approved it. The irony was brutal. The man who had helped impose the pacifist architecture now needed Japan to bend around it. But Korea was not a classroom argument. It was men dying in real time. MacArthur then made the decision that would destroy him. After the Incheon landing turned the war's momentum, UN forces advanced north. MacArthur believed China would not intervene at decisive scale. His confidence hardened into certainty. He was wrong. In late November 1950, Chinese forces struck across the front with a scale and ferocity that stunned UN commanders. In the mountains near the Chosin Reservoir, approximately 15,000 Marines and attached troops found themselves surrounded by a far larger Chinese force in temperatures so low that weapons froze, blood froze, and morphine froze in the tubes. The Chosin campaign belongs to a different kind of architecture, not ceremony, not constitution, survival. Major General Oliver P. Smith refused to accept the enemy's definition of the situation. When others called it retreat, the Marines turned the phrase into defiance. They were attacking in another direction. That line became famous because it did what MacArthur had done on the Missouri in a completely different environment. It seized the frame. A retreat is what the enemy forces you to do. An attack in another direction is a movement you define toward a chosen objective. For 17 days, the Marines fought south through snow. Roadblocks, exhaustion, and encirclement. They carried their wounded. They carried their dead. They brought out much of their equipment. They reached the sea. The cost was terrible. The Chinese forces suffered heavily as well. But Chosin also revealed the limit of MacArthur's gift. Architecture can define a ceremony. It can shape a government. It can organize memory. It cannot make a bad strategic assumption true. MacArthur's certainty about China had failed. His public conflict with President Harry Truman deepened. His statements moved beyond what civilian leadership would accept. On April 11, 1951, Truman relieved him of command. MacArthur returned to the United States for the first time in 14 years. 8 days later, he stood before Congress and gave the line that sealed his public myth. Old soldiers never die. They just fade away. He faded. But the structures he had built in Japan did not vanish with him. The peace treaty was signed in San Francisco in September 1951. The occupation ended in April 1952. Japan regained sovereignty. The Constitution remained. Article 9 remained. The self-defense forces would later grow into one of the most capable military organizations in Asia, while still wrapped inside constitutional language that denied the old state the right to wage war. The architecture bent. It did not break. And then there was Umezu, the man who had stood straight on the Missouri and refused to bow did not disappear into a footnote. He appeared before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in Tokyo. The courtroom itself carried the logic of the occupation. The tribunal met in a city under Allied authority, judging leaders of a state whose army had already been ordered to obey the Supreme Commander's directives. Umezu sat through the proceedings with the same controlled bearing he had shown on the battleship deck. Correct posture, measured face, no public collapse. In November 1948, he was sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes against peace and aggressive war. He received the sentence without visible drama. Then he was sent to Sugamo prison. 2 months later, in January 1949, he died of cancer while still incarcerated. His composure had changed nothing. Not the signature, not the occupation, not the Constitution, not the verdict. That is the coldest truth of the Missouri ceremony. MacArthur did not need Umezu to feel defeated. He needed him to participate in a structure where his feelings had no operational value. That is what made the surrender so complete. Not humiliation, not revenge, not theatrical dominance. A room built so precisely that the defeated man's dignity could remain intact while his power was removed completely. Shigemitsu's path proved the other half of the design. He had signed first, with hesitation. He was convicted by the tribunal and given a prison sentence. But he was later released, and by the 1950s, he returned to political life in a sovereign Japan, eventually serving again as foreign minister. That was the peace MacArthur's architecture had made possible. Not mercy without consequence, not punishment without future. A defeated elite split into two categories, those whose authority had to end, and those who could be folded into the new order if they accepted its terms. Wainwright returned home a hero, marked forever by captivity. Percival returned to Britain with a more complicated legacy. Hirohito remained emperor, but no longer as the living center of political sovereignty. MacArthur died in 1964, long after the occupation had ended, after memoirs, speeches, testimony, and a public image too large to fit neatly inside either praise or condemnation. But the moment that explains him best may still be that small space on the Missouri, the green cloth, the stiff Japanese general, the silent American commander. The liberated prisoners placed exactly where they had to be. The cameras, the harbor, the aircraft waiting above the clouds, the document with its signatures and even its correction marks. Because power is not always the loudest thing in the room. Sometimes power is the room, the table you must approach, the witness you cannot avoid, the document whose words are already stronger than your posture, the photograph that rearranges a nation's imagination, the Constitution that moves sovereignty from a sacred person to a people. The institution that survives the man who forced it into being. Umezu did not bow. MacArthur did not ask him to. The bow was never the mechanism. The mechanism was the architecture. And by the time the pen left the page, the architecture had already won.